Okay, welcome everyone to the webinar, Opportunities and Practices for Soil Carbon Management in the Southwest Slopes of New South Wales by Dr Karl Andersson and Dr Cassandra Schefe, and brought to you by the Soil CRC. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we are coming from today, the Wiradjuri, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Nick McGrath and I'm a Soil Project Officer with Holbrook Landcare Network, and I'm supported tonight by my colleague Jess Armstrong as well. Just letting you know that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be emailed to registered attendees and put on HLN's YouTube channel and the Soil CRC website. So if you have any issue with this, please let myself or Jess know. On the right hand side of your screen, there should be a chat box. Feel free to put any questions in there throughout the presentations, and at the end of the webinar there'll be discussion time, and I'll read those questions out to Karl and Cass to answer. I'll also put a SurveyMonkey link in there if you can please fill this short survey out before you leave tonight. So tonight's webinar is the third of 7 webinars presented by the Soil CRC, supported by New South Wales Government as part of the Primary Industries Productivity and Abatement Program, or PIPAP as it's known. So PIPAP is providing information to land managers about carbon farming to help them make evidence-based decisions. At the first webinar, we heard how visualising Australasian soils and a New South Wales e-spade provides spatial soil and land characteristics to assist with soil carbon planning. At the second webinar, we learn about the interpretation of soil data and land capability for considering the soil carbon project, including the factors above and below the ground impacting soil carbon, interpreting soil data to assess land suitability for increasing soil carbon, and identifying opportunities for additional land management practices to optimise soil carbon. Recordings of these webinars can be found at the New South Wales DPIRD website and the Soil Network of Knowledge website. So tonight our presenters will focus on our region soils, including soil carbon levels we can expect in our region, the factors that influence soil carbon levels, and the management practices that can increase soil carbon levels. And then I'll just hit the next slide. The next 4 webinars in this series will be hosted by other grower groups in New South Wales and will cover specific land management activities suited to their local environment. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and if Cass and Karl want to start sharing theirs. So tonight I'd like to introduce Dr Karl Andersson, Research Officer, Soil Carbon Officer for New South Wales DPIRD. A soil scientist with 25 years experience throughout New South Wales, Karl has worked in regions from the high rainfall to the semi-arid zones in fields including soil mapping, agronomy, soil carbon, nutrient cycling, irrigation, and dry land and urban development. Karl is based at Tamworth Agricultural Institute and works to enhance soil management practices within the New South Wales agricultural sector, and is experienced researcher and communicator of soil carbon information. We also have Dr Cassandra Schefe. Cass is a soil scientist with over 25 years experience in identifying and addressing soil constraints with a deep technical understanding of soil carbon dynamics within farming systems. Through her business, AgriSci, Cass works with farmers, industry and academia to support sustainable food production. She holds an adjunct position with Charles Sturt University and has authored over 20 scientific journal papers and numerous conference proceedings. She's also accredited as both a certified professional soil scientist by Soil Science Australia and a FERTCare accredited advisor. So take it away, Karl and Cass. Just a reminder that questions, put them in the chat box, and at the end of their presentations we'll go through those. So yeah, Carl and Cass, take it away when you're ready.
Thank you, Nick. So I'll kick off proceedings, but we'll be very much a tag team, as Carl and I have very much complementary experience and understanding of the soils and systems in the region. So first of all, would like to, on behalf of both of us, to thank Holbrook Landcare and the Soil CRC for inviting us to chat with you guys tonight, and really looking to work through some of the really simple but really fundamental aspects of soil carbon in our systems and the region we work in, and then the impact of different farming systems. So what we'll cover tonight is an overview of the farming systems in the region and the soil types that we have in the Holbrook and surrounding regions. We'll just quickly touch on a bit of a refresh on how soil carbon is made to make sure we're all on the same page. Then we'll go through factors that affect potential soil carbon values in farming systems. We'll talk about some leaking wine barrels. How do we set up for carbon success? Looking at soil carbon then within our cropping systems and within our mixed farming grazing systems, and some final comments at the end around what this means in a carbon market or a financial system. So, Carl. We know Carl is experiencing.
There we go. Thank you, Cass.
Right? Okay.
Thanks, everyone. So what we've got in front of us is a map from Nick, just showing the area that we're focusing on, coming from the high country in the east and falling down towards the plains there on the western side, which provides a really big range of properties and environmental conditions for soils to develop in. And underlying that, if you go next, Cass, thanks, are different rock types. In this map, things with a cross are granites. The general purple area is the sort of broad suite of older sedimentary rocks, which can contain quite a mix of materials that are often inverted. You can get fine and coarse and sort of hard and soft and salty and fresh type rocks in there. Giving us our soils, and there's a few other little orange bits showing up, which are some of the basalts that float over the top. And to be able to just have a closer look, if anyone's interested, if you go to the next one, Cass, this is a fairly new website, MinView. The address up the top might not be very clear, but it's MinView, MINVIEW. If you look for that, that's a really cool, handy website where you can zoom into where you are. There's legends on the left there to bring up, towns, roads, and geology layers. And as you zoom in, the legend on the right adjusts to where you are, and you can, click on it and find what it is. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a regional setting to talk about the next bit, which is the soils. So these are some profiles on granite parent material. The one on the right is from around Tumbarumba, and the same sort of material is at Wagga, which is the one in the middle. And again, the same sort of material is out of our region, but further west, out near Mount Hope, that one was. Rainfall falling as we go. Now, as these have developed in the landscape and under the climate, we can see that the one on the right there has got that dark layer at the top. And that's what we're talking about. That's the organic matter. It's really handy just to be able to see this. So that the dark stuff in soil is generally organic matter. When the influence of that, when there isn't much of that, the main colour driver is iron and different forms of iron. But the pale layer underneath in that profile, between the dark and the red, is the absence of organic matter and the absence of iron. And in fact, if iron's gone, pretty much everything else is gone, fertility-wise. So that's a really relatively infertile, sandy type of layer. And that's what you get developing on the sandy granites in high rainfall. Going to the middle one, that same material at a lower rainfall around Wagga, we do have a darkish layer at the surface. It's a little bit hard to see in that one, but it's there. There's a pale layer as well, which is not as not as depleted in the medium sort of rainfall. And it's a similar position to the landscape, but it's not as deep. So quite a different range there. And the one out west is just basically red and hasn't got much organic matter at the surface at all. So a clear sort of influence there of what rainfall provides in organic matter. So just a thing that we can see what the soils are like. And just imagine the roots growing through this material. Fertility at the top, running through that second layer that can hold, can supply a bit of moisture, but then they'll get into the soil with more guts into that subsoil. If you just go to the next one, please, Cass. This is a range of soils on the sedimentary or the meta sediments around Wagga. These ones. So top of the slope going down, we obviously get deeper soils. The example there at the top of the slope with only shallow roots. As we're going down, we're getting deeper and a bit more development and some of that deeper subsoil in the mid-slope. And as we're getting to the bottom, we're seeing not as red. It's a little bit more sort of leached, but we've got deeper material and hopefully a bit of a concentration of organic matter at the surface. So there's just the sorts of trends that we can see, and you just have that in your mind about water, fertility, and plants growing through these different soils as a as a basis for them growing and providing what we're after, which is produce, but also their sort of resilience to the effects of the environmental effects of what we're doing. Now this one here is some data that we collected over a few years of a project that did cover the Holbrook area and a wider area from Tumbarumba out west towards Swan Hill. As we look a clean slice running west to east, we see that big influence of rainfall. Not much in general was happening until you get to about sort of 550, 600 mils, and then you get an increase that then starts to plateau out around 1,000 mil. That's in the 0 to 10, but in the 10 to 20, there's much less accumulation and much slower. It wasn't really responding till about 850, and you can see there that it just sort of got to a lower level, and that really represents in numbers what those profiles were just showing a little bit earlier. Most of the action is in the surface, and a little bit can happen down a bit deeper there.
So Karl, with that, would you be saying that those soil carbon values would reflect differences in plant growth potential and biomass inputs into those systems due to the rainfall?
Yeah, they've developed over a long period of time. Soils developed over thousands of years. So that's the sort of result of plants growing, dropping their litter and leaves at the surface, that decomposing slowly into soil. So soil organic matter carbon is part of the soil organic matter. It's the dark stuff there that you saw. It concentrates naturally at the surface. Roots can mine stuff from deeper down. Roots are part of what delivers organic matter into soil, but much less sort of concentration over time in those, yeah. And provides fertility through the cycling of that. I suppose the key point, another key point out of it is that it's the best stuff. It's at the surface, so it's most prone to loss. So it really sort of highlights the importance of looking after it, not only for say counting carbon for trading purposes, but that what it provides for the resilience in your soils that we'll sort of get to. Looking after it and keeping it there is a really key thing.
Which actually flows into kind of a bit of a check-in that we wanted to make, just to make sure that everyone's fully on board with actually what soil carbon is and how it is formed. When we talk about carbon and particularly in the market settings, but also more generally, we tend to refer to it and consider carbon as this black box in soil, that it's all about what's in the soil, but we don't really think about what's required to get it there in the first place. So as Karl mentioned around the rainfall dependency and the biomass inputs into our system, it's really just worth remembering that most of the carbon in our systems comes there through plants. And so we come back to the really simple and very fundamental aspect of photosynthesis. knowing that without plants in the system, we're really not capturing that biomass. So knowing that CO2 in the atmosphere gets captured through photosynthesis, converted into sugars and carbohydrates into the plant, and then that can move through into plant and root biomass. Then with our litter in the systems, we have microbes decomposing this material and breaking it down into organic matter, which is what we all refer to. Those microbes die, they get decomposed by other microbes, and this continuous cycling process is really what's required for the refinement of organic molecules in our system containing carbon and differences in the bioavailability of that material. So if you look at that whole process, if there is a net accumulation of carbon, then we can say that carbon from the atmosphere has been captured or sequestered into soil. The challenge we have is that it's not a perfect process. Just like us, microbes breathe in oxygen and they breathe out CO2. So every time there's microbial activity in soil, we're actually losing carbon through the respiration processes from the microbes. In addition to the CO2 that they release, there's also a lot of microbes that exhale nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases. So we're kind of in this balancing act of we want carbon in our systems, we want organic matter in our systems, but we also want microbial activity. We want microbial function. We want biological cycling as a key aspect of soil health. So when we're considering where we're up to with our carbon source and what we want out of organic matter and soil carbon, we really need to consider that we can't have everything. If we want a healthy functional cycling system, that means that there's going to be a lot of cycling and turnover of organic matter. Our ability to increase those levels is then dependent on some of the constraints in our system and some of the environmental limits that we're dealing with. So in terms of those factors that affect potential soil carbon values, and Karl's certainly shown the range across a rainfall gradient, but at a really simple level, we know that climate is really important. So soils in subtropical and tropical regions can build more carbon because of that moist, warm conditions, which mean that we've got higher biomass inputs and higher biological activity. We also know that our soil type and condition is highly important in how much organic matter and carbon we can hold. So we know sandy soils can hold less carbon because they have less surface area and less exchange capacity, so less ability to chemically bind with organic matter in our soils. We also know that low pH soils can build less carbon because there's impaired microbial function under those conditions, which we'll talk about a bit more. We also know that crusted, dispersive or compacted soils require amelioration before they can build more carbon. And we know that there's this whole level of constraints and limitations we need to focus on before really worrying about what's happening in soil carbon accrual, which we'll touch on a bit more. The key thing we really need to think about is that each soil has a threshold carbon capacity. So we're not expecting an ongoing linear increase over time and with increasing inputs. So it's really about managing those expectations. So even as we increase our organic inputs into our system, the higher we get with our organic matter levels, the more effort and energy and inputs will be required to maintain and continue to build those. So we're really looking at the law of diminishing returns. In terms of how do we set up for carbon success, I mentioned already the role of soil constraints in our system. And a really easy way to think about it is Liebig's law of the minimum with the wine barrel or the leaking bucket. So whichever factor is most limiting in terms of our soil chemical or physical parameters will then also be the most limiting in terms of how much organic matter and carbon we can build. As a general rule, in the Holbrook region and up in the hills, all the way through to the plains, we know that soil pH and soil acidity is generally the most limiting factor in plant growth in our highly productive farming systems. So I'll actually take the next step to say that unless you know otherwise, assume that soil acidity is constraining plant growth, and in that way is also constraining your ability to build organic matter. If you don't have numbers to prove otherwise, you really need to be considering that you are working within an acidic system. What What we know, and this is not new, this is very well accepted, we know that many plant species, particularly the ones that we want in our systems, so our productive pasture species and our crop species, we know that they can't grow well and persist at low pH values. We know our legumes, our lucines, even our phalaris, subclovers, a lot of those will struggle once we get down to those values. We also know that many nutrients are less available as we go to low pHs. Phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, molybdenum are all going to be less available to the plant. A key aspect of that is that with nitrogen, in terms of the microbial function that converts organic nitrogen into nitrates, is also impaired. And then the efficiency with which plants can take up and utilise the nitrogen fertilisers in our system is also limited. Generally, we have poor plant response to our applied fertilisers because of this acidity, and we have reduced microbial function, as we've talked about before. This is across the board in terms of our soil health, and this is something that we've measured well across the cropping systems and also into the mountains and into the hills. In those levels where we've got really low pH values, we may appear to have organic matter, but it's only there because there's no microbial respiration. There's no function, which means that any litter is just sitting on the surface and not being utilised. We also have poor rhizobium inoculation of our legumes. We know we have poor persistence of lucerne. The other thing to consider is that once pH is increased through liming, we need to ensure that other soil conditions aren't limiting plant growth. So what's the next one on the list? Always making sure that we're spending money and inputs and effort into supporting our system. We want to make sure that we're getting bang for buck for what we're doing. So an example of very stark realisation of the impact of low pH values is in the nodulation of these subclover plants. The ones on the left have been under good pH conditions, and the ones on the right were in acid soils. But this is not a new thing for around the Holbrook region. I know Holbrook Landcare have been working in this space for a long time. So hopefully this is all stuff that is really much common sense. But the connection between soil pH and carbon is completely connected. The other constraints that we need to consider, and which are common in our region, are first of all soil sodicity. This is probably more common on the plains as we get towards the west end of the catchment. And we have the challenges. We have surface sodicity, we have subsurface sodicity, and then we have deep soil sodicity, sometimes all in the same place and sometimes all mixed up. We can also have acidity and sodicity in the same soil layers at the same time. So really pay attention to what's going on. We don't have a lot of issues with salinity in our productive landscapes here, but it's always something to keep in mind, considering the significant research that's been done in that in the region over the last 20 years. Compaction, as we know, will reduce the ability of plant roots to penetrate. Waterlogging and drainage issues reduces oxygen availability to roots and microbes. Nutrient deficiencies and toxicities will reduce our plant vigour and competition. The common theme in all of this is that if we're going to do carbon well, we need to optimise our plant growth and microbial function. It's not a separate thing. The focus really does come down to supporting that plant well and supporting the associated microbial community. Images that we've got here are just showing a soil with slaking and sodicity on the top and slaking, which is another issue there, and then effect of sodic and waterlogged conditions on emergence. In terms of the management practices that we think about in cropping systems, we really, again, need to focus on how do we support a good farming system. There's been a lot of conflicting communications and angst around soil carbon in cropping, and a lot of the themes that are coming through are kind of saying, well, look, we're not seeing changes, we're not improving, we're not doing things well. But I think we're actually doing a lot better than what we give ourselves credit for, and what the general messages look like. From work that we've done in the region, we know that biomass input is a significant contribution. This is both in current work we're doing and in a lot of the long-term trials that have been done in southern New South Wales. The role of legume-based pastures and pulses is key to maintaining our soil carbon. The value of these systems are not just the biomass that they bring into the system, but also the high organic nitrogen component. We know, and we'll talk through a bit more, that we can't have carbon in our systems without nitrogen. So we've got a very strong evidence base to show that having that legume component is really pivotal to maintaining and increasing our soil carbon values. Crop residues, we know, are also key. There's been a lot of work, a lot of discussion around the fact that we've been doing everything right with crop residues over a long time, but we haven't been increasing our soil carbon values. And the confusion is, I'm retaining my stubbles, I'm doing everything right, what's going on? What we know is that we've increased our yields in these systems probably by double over the last 40 years. We're doing everything we can to improve productivity and biomass. And we know that it's a cycling system. So we actually know, and I'll step through this in a little bit further to demonstrate that we are doing a lot better with our residue inputs than what we actually think is going on. I've already mentioned soil constraint amelioration. So growing the best plant possible is key to improving the ability to hold organic matter and carbon. System fertility is something that we don't tend to think about enough. We really focus on what's happening with the nutrients that we're adding for specific agronomy reasons, or just putting the fertilizers in to growing that plant. But we know that we can't maintain or grow soil carbon without adequate nutrition. Over the last 6 years, we've sampled about 1,600 GPS points in southern New South Wales in our cropping soils, and we've clearly demonstrated that soils with a high soil carbon value also have a good pH status, also have a good legume history, and also have good yields. So that connection between biomass, yields, and carbon and good farming systems is really well related. In terms of the range of soil carbon values that we've measured from our cropping systems in southern New South Wales, we've got a big range, obviously. Within the Holbrook region, the median's around 1.55, and our range is from 0.7 up to 4.5% carbon, which is far in excess of what we'd be expecting in our systems. So this is really exciting because it gives us somewhere to build to and start to interrogate as to what's going on. And just focusing on the fertility aspect a little bit more, we know that, as I mentioned, that we need other nutrients in the system to maintain plant biomass and to improve and maintain soil carbon values. This is just some examples to demonstrate the role of the other nutrients. So on the left is some international work to demonstrate that as we increase our nitrogen input into our cropping systems over a long period of time from 1985 to 2010, we have significantly increased the soil organic carbon in those systems. And this is long-term replicated work. The similar results have been reflected in a number of other international trials and also reflect what's happening in Australian conditions through long-term trials run by Incitec Pivot and some of the other long-term fertiliser companies. Then we have the work from Clive Kirkby, which has been around for some time and you've probably heard with us. And this really reflects the fact that as we increase our soil carbon levels in our organic matter, we're also increasing our soil nitrogen, our organic P levels, and our soil sulphur levels. So again, carbon doesn't exist in isolation. Just finally, before I hand back to Karl, just wanted to flag again this concept that I'm doing everything right, but my numbers aren't going up. And if you can just work with me through this very, very simply, if we look at the fact that our stable organic matter in our system has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 10:1, so 10 units of carbon to 1 unit of nitrogen. We know that when we convert organic matter into plant available nitrogen, so we mineralise that N out of organic matter, we know that we can mineralise up to 100 kilos of nitrogen per year. So that's organic matter nitrogen converted for plant use. Maintaining those ratios, which are environmentally stable, means that that process could result in the loss of up to 1,000 kilograms of carbon or a tonne of carbon lost as CO2, purely through microbial respiration and enzymatic activities. If our carbon and nitrogen is not replaced in our farming systems, this process would result in the ongoing depletion of soil carbon, which was evidenced in the early years of cultivation and cropping in our farming systems. But if we come back next year and we measure the same soil carbon value in our systems, and I've just used 1% to keep the maths really simple. In essence, we're looking at 1.5 to 2.53%. But fundamentally, if we're maintaining the same soil carbon value next year and the year after, that means that by default we've brought in up to 1,000 kilos of carbon and 100 kilos of nitrogen to maintain those soil carbon values. So I'm hoping this makes sense, but if you don't remember any of this, just consider that in highly functional agricultural systems where we're exporting a lot of product every year, so we're mineralising and working our organic matter really hard. If we still have the same carbon value next year and the year after as what we had before, that's, in my mind, one of the definitions of sustainable agriculture, because it's an actively fluxing system and we're maintaining those. So that's something that we should be recognising and rewarding in our farming. So I'd like to hand back to Karl to give us a bit more of a focus on our grazing systems.
Thanks, Cass. Lots of interesting points there to discuss. Okay, so management around carbon levels. If I link in just from what Cass was saying there about are levels moving or not, and she mentioned functioning, you can see, you could on one hand think that, oh, they're not going up, I'm doing something wrong, or I'm not hitting a target I want to get. But the fact that they're stable is supporting everything you just said, and it means it's a good sign that soils are functioning and doing all that cycling. The bugs that are there providing all these things, that it's a sign that they're alive rather than just increasing. And I think, Cassie, you might have mentioned already, or just in a separate conversation, how some areas where you can have quite high levels of carbon in the soil is in fact a sign or a result of things not functioning, where there's just build up and no cycling, where any of those constraints that Cass just mentioned are stopping the bugs working and not really sort of providing a support for what we're doing. Now, so going from that, like what can we do around carbon levels and well, importantly, really organic matter. The soil organic carbon sort of falls away and people just say carbon, but it's soil first and then organic second and then carbon. Soil is the most important thing. Organic is the cycling stuff, and then carbon's basically the backbone of it. We've got to remember the importance of the soil organic carbon, the soil organic matter really as well. Sarah McDonald did a review last year on the effects of grazing around Australia. So there's lots of talk around using grazing management to increase soil carbon levels. But what she found was there's only 30 papers, which is still a good number, that addressed grazing and soil carbon specifically. No overall effect on things like stocking rate, intensity, rotation, number of paddocks, period of rest, and all that sort of thing. Now, that just sort of supports what we're just talking about is a functioning system. What could be seen was that there could be more biomass and more ground cover under different grazing regimes, but not necessarily consistently more organic carbon. Which just goes, again, just reiterating the point of they're not parked systems, they're still operating. Yeah. So maybe the next slide. Thanks, Cass. And in a cropping system, sorry, This particular set of data was from work done at the Condo Research Station over a number of years, where there were different rotations or different management systems in place. So continuous crop or conventional cultivation, reduced tillage, permanent pasture, conservation cultivation, those various treatments. And what we've got in the on the left-hand side is our surface, 0 to 10 centimetres, and on the right, the 10 to 30 centimetres. So over time, all of the treatments were increasing in their carbon levels from 1.2, which I'll say is low, and we'll get back to that, increasing up through 1.8 or so. Great, but then we've got a drop. All of a sudden, it's disappeared. Now, a few things about that. There's a general increase over time, which is driven by environmental conditions. Relatively dry environment, a bit drier than where we're talking about, but an increase there. And what it seemed to be was that when there was a break in drought, say, or wetter periods, the bugs kicked into gear and broke down the organic matter that had accumulated. Now, again, going back, it's not a bad thing. This accumulation of organic matter in lay farming is about letting cycles sort of catch up, micronutrient cycles catch up. Organic matter is a massive store of not only P, but sulfur and nitrogen. And what looks like a loss of carbon is actually mineralization and resupply of those nutrients back into the system. Again, in the 10 to 30, if you think about the profiles I was talking about earlier, much less activity in the subsurface and lower levels in general compared to the surface. But again, a bit of a trend up and then dropping at depth. I did mention a second ago what's a good level, and some of the things that Cass has been talking about. And she touched on that slaking. When you're looking at your soil, a good level is where it's stable and resilient. Basically, doing that little test there, where she had some water in addition, put a little piece of soil in it. If it stays together, that's organic matter acting as ropes and glues and holding the particles together. And what that indicates is that when rain is falling, the soil will stay and have its integrity, and the water can get in. If it's slaking, it falls apart and seals, and that is basically your field indicator of if you've got a good level or not a good level, basically. And it's around that sort of 1.2. Once you're getting above 1.2, you're starting to get that sort of good physical resilience. Now, that window that was just up and down that was just there a second ago, unfortunately, that was the end of it, of that trial. The things are gone, and it's one set of data. What we might see is that up and down cycling would continue over time. Unfortunately, we lack long-term trials. We have comparisons, but we really get the key information out of long-term trials. What we would want to see in that is basically that the service would be operating in a level window or possibly trending up would be great, but we wouldn't want to see it falling down into that sort of unstable level. Next one, maybe Cass. Now, so that pattern that we just talked about, that was from Condo, but that's not the only place that happens. We've got some data that's not quite yet ready for publishing from the Central West in New South Wales, where we're up to about the fourth sampling has just been done. The first three showed an interesting pattern of increasing between the first and second, and most of those gains, in 6 out of 8 of those gains disappeared. Now, they didn't disappear and they've gone, it's a loss, but it's just another indication of that cycling. A couple of papers here that we've got on screen, or a couple of bits of work, where John Gray and others on the left-hand side looked at what opportunities do we have. So we do know that there's been decrease in carbon levels over time in many soils, and this is looking at what opportunities could we find to increase levels. This was done on a national sort of increase of 10% long-term veg cover, which could be, you know, into pasture phases. Yeah, basically more cover. And what it's showing is that we've got low potential out west, increasing potential in through the slopes, but then pockets of where you can see some really high potential and actually then really low potential. Those areas could be that they've got soils that are receptive, clay soils and fertile areas that can actually, you can sort of build and hold it in, or areas that are just sort of maxed out at their potential. And there's a patch of that yellow just sort of in our area there, and that might be sort of under trees there, just sort of near the west of ACT. So you can use that to zone in on sort of potential areas for increasing carbon levels. What's in front of us though, and the whole reason that there's discussion around carbon and what are we going to do and get paid for it is because of climate change and the effect of atmospheric carbon levels and what that means. What they mean is high temperatures on average and more intermittent rainfall on average. We're just experiencing that in the last few weeks. It's been a really nice end to winter. I don't know if winter's supposed to have 30 degrees, but there we go. With warmer temperatures, bugs are more active. We get peat when it's cold and wet. When bugs are active, they can cycle through organic matter more quickly. So there's 4 maps there where we've got 2 scenarios of middle of the road or high emissions, so extra climate forcing into the 2050s or the 2090s. And the legend on the right, that's a little bit small, but what it's showing is up the top is 0 and it's going down to 40 odd. And it's all negative. All the projected effects of climate change are to stifle consistent production inputs and accelerate the opportunities for decomposition. So we are looking, we're going to struggle to hold on to what we've got. So it just sort of makes the management of what we do have all that more important, and the things that Cass has been talking about, you know, supporting and maintaining your productive systems. We'll do there, Cass, thanks. Okay, so this is the last little area before we wrap up for some questions. So just sort of leading into that idea that I just mentioned around carbon credits, some questions that you might want to ask of yourself or others if you're looking at undertaking a carbon project is around what commitments are required. There is a list of activities that are approved for carbon projects, which is what, you know, you're changing activity to sequester carbon. They're basically agronomic. In fact, I think they're all agronomic sets of advice to overcome constraints, really. The requirement on you is for how long and what sort of how long you, basically how long you need to maintain those things and what options you might have, what flexibility is in there, and what options you have if they don't work for you. You really want to know what your starting point is, because what we see is that there's greatest scope for increasing when you've got low levels. Some people take that as okay, I'll drive it down so I can get an increase. Please don't take it that way. For all the things we've been talking about, you don't want to be losing carbon out of your system, organic matter out of your system, because it provides a real fundamental basis for what you're doing. I've heard these things touted there in inverted commas. People will guarantee increases. I'll say that additionality is easy, as opposed to what Cassie pointed to earlier of that sort of diminishing returns, where soils get to a level that they sort of operate in. That's their sort of natural ceiling. It's dynamic, but it's a natural ceiling. People have made claims of infinite capacity for carbon in your soil. Hearing those sorts of things just should raise some antennas for you. And with all the work that we do and see, there's always, it's not always one way. So there are examples of where there's increases and decreases, as we've seen. If you're talking to someone, some of the questions you might ask are there any examples of success that they've had that's relevant to you and your systems? And importantly, where things may not have increased, and being open about that, and how rigorous is any proof around these activities that you might be getting into. So I guess sort of wrapping up a few ideas. Understanding what you've got and valuing what you've got is really important. There's different sources of information that we've looked at in the 3 webinars so far, and you can get a good idea of the starting point that you've got and have a look at your soils and what capacity they've got. Basically, you're looking to support and increase soil organic matter with inputs, which is plant growth, which is what you're after, and anything that lessens the outputs can help build it. So that's less disturbance and, importantly, less erosion. It is hard and slower to increase, so be realistic about that. But also on the flip side, it's really easy to lose it sometimes. We do know a lot about the dynamics of it, but sometimes there's still more to learn, because the long-term, we just don't have many long-term in situ trials. So some of those things that Cassie was talking about with the fertilizer companies that she's been working with, data out of those sorts of things is really important. Having that practices maintained on a place to see the dynamics, which gives much more information than just cross fence comparisons. A couple of points that some people from other areas have alerted me to has been that ag basically is in a situation where there's opportunities of increasing carbon, and that's attractive to other areas that are wanting to offset their emissions. So hence that market. But ag has its own sort of backyard to look after, and there's coming down the supply chain is interest for low emissions intensity farming systems. If you can quantify and show that you've got relatively low emissions for your production system, that would mean that you're a more attractive supplier for someone down the supply chain, because it gives them a lower footprint, and that ag itself will need to hold as much credits as it can for its own offsets before it's looking to support other areas.
And Nick, sorry, Carl, if I can just finish up on that one as well with the market access point is, as we've been talking about before, the key essence around soil carbon maintenance and building in our systems is around supporting the best possible plants that we can grow. In the same way with our low emissions intensity farming systems, our ability to demonstrate through the supply chain that we are doing well is fundamentally around demonstrating good farming practices. If we can grow the best plant, we can grow the best productivity, sell off the weights of cattle or cropping or hay, whatever it is that our commodities are. If we can produce those well and use our inputs well and efficiently to produce that, by default, that will be reducing the intensity of the emissions required to create that product. So when we're looking at low emissions farming, looking at how we report and support those kind of systems, rather than focusing on soil carbon, rather than focusing on emissions, if we focus on doing our best farming practices that we can, that are the best systems in our environment, that's where we're going to really make those gains. And there's already some programs working in this space, such as the Cool Soil Initiative and others, which are looking at how we can support farmers in those reporting the low emission systems and working with companies to understand what they need. So just a bit more context around that last point. Thank you, Karl. And
yep, thanks, Cass. I think we're good, aren't we?
I think we're done. So I think we're up for questions.
Righto, very good. Thanks, Karl. Thanks, Cass. Very informative. Yeah, we've got 8 minutes to 8, so yeah, we'll hook straight into some questions. There's a few here, so I'll start off with the first one. Biochar. So biochar is highly rich in carbon. My question is, if we add more doses of biochar in soil, can it cause negative effects on plant growth? Don't know which one of you want to tackle that one.
I'll take that one, Nick. So we know biochar has a really long history of demonstrating value into our soils and systems. I understand that my interpretation of that question is that if we put too much carbon in, can that then have an impact on nitrogen and fertilizer, like fertility and plant growth? Because of the stable forms of biochar, the fact that it is only slowly interacting with the soil environment, it's really, to my knowledge, we've seen more positive impacts around its influence on soil structure and water holding capacity and biological function than a negative impact. But the challenge with biochar is that every product is different based on source and process. So if there was options to have a play with biochar in your systems at a rate that was economical or a source that was economical, then certainly just do some of your own testing on farm to see how it worked in your systems. I think that's really all we can say based on the variation of products that are out there.
Okay, great.
Yeah, biochars aren't biochars exactly. Not only the source material, but the temperature that it is formed at has a variation. But there are the physical things that you just said. It can improve nutrient retention and cycling as well, and it has a liming effect often. And the overall benefit is sort of shown of where they were found and how they were found. They were called terra preta. They were found in the Amazon thousands of years after they were made by the peoples there. These areas in what are quite depleted soils, tropical soils, these areas were found as much more productive, and then they found what was there was these biochar filled soils. So yeah, overall quite good.
Very good. I'll go to the next question. In an earlier slide, Karl presented with 3 profiles, soil profiles. The one in the high rainfall zone had minimal carbon at deeper layers. Could deep-rooted pasture species address this?
Well, address or change. It's basically a sign of how they develop. That's what's happened over many thousands of years. That pattern. So it's sort of a definition of a topsoil has more organic matter, and that pale layer that I showed is one of those ones in those sort of sandier materials that are depleted naturally. How could you increase it? Some of the ideas and interest around carbon at depth can stem from there being, when we look at it and measure the organic matter at depth, the carbon at depth, is that it's older. And so the idea becomes, well, if it's older there, that means it will last for longer. But what it instead really shows, I think, is that it's taken. Yeah, that might be 3,000-4,000 years old. But what that actually means is that over not just last year, not just the last cropping cycle or pasture phase, and not only just after, since your old man was there, since ag started, but over that amount of time, 4,000 years, and all we've got is 0.5%. That's pretty much a situation of how it's going to be. And in fact, putting some of those nutrient cycles that Cass was talking about, there's work to show that fresh organic matter, whether through roots or exudates, into subsoils can prime the system. So a supply of fresh nutrients and easily mineralizable energy can actually get the bugs kicked into gear, and they can then not only eat that stuff up, but they decompose the older material that's been there as well. So again, yeah, it's all just a cycle, and things functioning is great. And I guess what I was just showing is how carbon is distributed through the profile in general.
Yep.
And Karl, if I can add to that, we've also done some research to show that if we add fresh organic matter to the surface, so compost, manures, very carbohydrate rich organic materials, that can also have a priming effect, which sparks up the microbial community, cracks through that organic matter that you've added, and then can also eat into that prior organic matter or the pre-existing carbon. So if we do like a stimulus package of adding amendments, really fresh carbohydrate rich amendments, and we don't manage those inputs to sustain increased biomass into the future, we can actually go backwards through creating a hordes of hungry microbes that crunch through everything, and then they breed up, and there's lots more of them, increased populations, and then they go hunting for anything else they can find. So it's completely complex and painful most of the time.
Yeah. And not a bad thing for all that. That's all that cycling and functioning soil. And nor are roots at depth a bad thing. I'm not saying that at all. Right, they're accessing more moisture, they hold on through droughts. The difference between plants that survive or not through droughts can be their rooting depth, or whether that's making it through hard layers, or just things that can naturally go deeper, find water reserves, fill grain. It's really important for filling grain in a dry pinch at the end of a season. All that sort of stuff is great. Things that can punch through hard layers can create channels for roots to follow and break things up. Like it's all interesting and important, but it's not just. I suppose we fall back to carbon just for its own sake, but it's part of a system.
Yep, great. Next question. I see you've answered it, Cass, I believe in the chat, but if you could expand on that. So the question is there an optimum crop rotation for improving soil carbon? Or even just repeat what you got in the chat there.
So I was trying to keep things efficient to time, Nick, in case we didn't get a chance to answer everything.
No, that's all right.
All the long-term trials that have been done in Australia demonstrate that the best cropping systems include a pasture phase, and the best pasture phases are those that are well managed. So it's not just the young grass iridium mix, kind of just poking along, feeding a few sheep, but it's actually setting up a really high biomass, high cycling turnover pasture with that is legume based, is our best opportunity to build organic matter into the systems. If we can't do pastures because we don't like sheep, or we don't have a opportunity to do that, then having an annual legume in the system. So one of the pulses or vetches or even legumes, lucens, although that's more of a pasture phase, but any of those annual legumes will always have a really good benefit. The kicker as well is obviously we want to get the most out of those legumes, which means we have to be ensuring that our pHs are good, that we're not waterlogging, we're supporting the biomass nitrogen contribution of those legumes as best as we can, and ensuring that our fertility of our other nutrients are in play to, again, really fire that system up so that it can have maximum benefit going forward. And so this is what the long-term trials have shown. In current work that we've got with the Cool Soil Initiative and other programs, we're consistently seeing these rotations kind of coming to the fore, and having all these benefits in addition to what we know about the nitrogen cycling. But the combination of a legume plus good fertility plus managing soil constraints is our best chance to do well.
And part of that as well includes managing livestock well and looking after the soil physical condition. Often you can get to the end of a pasture phase and the soil is compacted. If livestock have been on there when it's wet or it's too bare, and physically it's just the soil is squashed. And what that can mean is that well, people have got to rip it to open up and make a seed bed to get something growing again. That ripping is a key reason why you get a lot of mineralisation happening. It's often attributed to, well, you move out of a pasture phase into a crop and you've got lower carbon levels. Some of that is actually that ripping that can be part of it. Some of the work that we, that big data set I mentioned earlier with the trend from east to west, when you get into sort of out of a controlled environment, out of a controlled sort of trial back into the paddock in reality, we could actually find that there were areas where cropping soils had higher carbon levels than pasture soils, just from how they're managed in the end. It still comes down to good management for whatever it is that you're doing.
That's a good segue, Karl, into the final question we got here in the chat. What are the likely percentage increases in soil organic carbon expected with changed land management? What practice would provide the maximum and most stable increase in soil carbon?
Practice, having a nice fertile soil with good rain. There are a range of studies that have shown increases. Rates of, say, 0.2, as low as that, 0.3, up to, say, 0.5, up to 1 tonne per hectare per year. But importantly, thinking back to what Cass was saying earlier, but that diminishing marginal returns, they're generally off low bases. And once the system catches up, they sort of flatten out and can go back to that condo circumstance where I showed, and not only that one, but many others, where okay, now it's back up into a phase, and then it's just cycling. So within that window, and so early increases off a low base, but then back to a resilient system, hopefully.
And just to add to that, the caveat is always rainfall, as we mentioned. We know that a lot of the long-term trials in Australia show that the soil carbon values do follow rainfall patterns. So as much as we can do everything right, we're in a good rainfall period, we're increasing biomass, we're pumping everything through, it's amazing. Next time we hit a drought or a low rainfall period and we're reducing our biomass inputs, we will actually start to mine down those soil carbon reserves. So the most stable things we can do is actually put charcoal in soil, which is not what we're aiming to do because that doesn't have a low contribution to what we're doing. But if we wanted stable, that's really the only kind of gold-plated stable stuff we've got in some of the biochars. But fundamentally, we know that we want cycling and we want function. If we want to grow something, if we want to export a product, either meat, grain, anything else, we need a functional cycling system. So we can't be wanting flux and dynamic and productivity and lock it in the bank under the black box vault and put a dollar value on it. The two systems are quite contrasting in kind of what we expect. So just, we're always riding the roller coaster of soil moisture. And as long as we are, then, stability is something we can strive for, but nothing's certain, really.
Yeah, cycling is the key thing. It's like an economy. All the money's in the bank, not much is happening. There's one little depends I'll throw there, Cassie. Like when we do agronomic testing, we don't test straight after a drought breaks because we know there's a flush of mineralisation and you get elevated P levels. So there's little dynamics happening all the time. But in general, absolutely, the more rainfall that supports higher carbon levels, organic matter levels.
The best practice for increasing carbon is rain. And a nice clay soil.
Yeah, and effective rainfall, which comes back to a good level of organic matter in your soil. Lets rain go in, lets plants grow. So it's that feedback system. The best thing for soil is an actively growing plant for lots of reasons. You just sort of got to be realistic about where you're going to get to. and keep an eye on it.
Very good. Well summed up. Final call for questions. If anyone's got any other questions, feel free even just raise your hand or unmute yourself and fire away. What people are thinking, I'll just I'll put a survey link in the chat box before you leave tonight. Can you please fill that out? Your feedback's very much appreciated. It's just a short 3-question survey. So yeah, looking like there's no other questions, and we are over time. So I'll wrap this up. I'll just share my screen again just to remind everyone of the of the upcoming webinars. Can you all see the upcoming webinars on your screen? Jess? Yep.
Looks
Carl.
good, Nick. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Okay. So yep. Thanks everyone for coming along tonight, and to Cass and Karl for presenting. As I said before, the future webinars will be delivered by other Soil CRC participants, researchers, and industry. And you can see there, Central West Farming Systems, Riverine Plains, Mallee, Sustainable Farming, and FarmLink will be involved in delivering these webinars over the next couple of months. So keep an eye on the Soil CRC events page. I think Felicity put a link in as well to those events in the chat. So check those out. Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining. And we'll see you all later.